caught my husband with my sister-in-law at my brother's wedding. My brother saw it too, and he exposed them both to over 200 guests. That's the core of it. The absolute shockwave that shattered my life. If you looked at me on that beautiful Saturday in Lake Tahoe, you would have seen a happy woman glowing at her twin brother Connor's wedding. My husband, Owen, was supposed to be my other half, my safe and predictable love for 4 years. We were, by all accounts, perfectly normal, perfectly secure. The ceremony was a dream. The reception was buzzing. Then Owen stepped out, claiming a quick trip to the bathroom. When 20 minutes dragged by, a cold, sick feeling replaced the joy in my gut. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I followed that awful instinct down a quiet service corridor. That's when I heard it. A muffled sound coming from a storage room. My hands were shaking, but I had to know. I nudged the door open. It was Owen. And Kendall, Jasmine's younger sister, the maid of honor. They were right there, not even noticing the door crack open. But I wasn't the only one who saw. Connor, my brother, was right behind me. He saw the whole unforgivable scene. He didn't scream or rage. He just took my hand, slammed the door shut with a horrifying boom, and started walking back to the reception. "Connor, what are you doing?" I whispered, my voice raw. He looked at me with an icy resolve I'd never witnessed. "Justice," he said. The next moments were a blur of brilliant, brutal revenge, but the full story is much darker than a simple cheating scandal. It's about how they meticulously built this betrayal, stealing my peace and my security for 8 months. This is my confession of how I was so utterly deceived, and how I found the strength to fight back. This is a painful and raw story, and to make sure you hear every part of how I went from the victim in that corridor to the woman who rebuilt her life, join me for the rest of this journey. The walk back into that ballroom felt like wading through cement. My body was on autopilot, dragging my shaking legs past the 100 silent, staring faces as Connor, my brave, furious twin, climbed onto the stage. I was still trying to process the heavy, chemical scent of betrayal on my own hands. My mind was screaming for a safe place, for that impossible moment in the storage room to unhappen. But it didn't. I watched Connor take the microphone. He was the picture of a charming, happy groom 1 second, and the next, he was stone cold. He waited for the music to stop completely. That silence, before he spoke, was the worst sound I have ever heard. He didn't make a scene. He created a moment. He just said he had an important announcement to make before the cake cutting. And then he dropped the bomb. That his fiancée and my husband were having an affair, and that they were together in the storage room right now. He looked at Jasmine, who went ghost white. Then he took off his ring, placed it on the beautiful 4-tiered cake table, and just walked out. I ran after him, deafened by the explosion of noise and chaos that erupted behind us. The yelling, the crying, the horrifying sounds of a family disintegrating. Owen and Kendall came out minutes later. They looked disheveled, guilty, and panicked, meeting the full, searing hatred of 200 stunned people. I didn't look at Owen. I couldn't. My parents were already confronting him, their faces masks of pure, protective rage. But I just followed Connor. He was my anchor. We ended up driving to an anonymous motel, miles away from the venue, sitting in silence for hours. I was shaking too hard to cry. I remember looking at my hands, thinking, these hands cooked him dinner. These hands held his hand. These hands touched a liar. The next day, the shock started wearing off, giving way to a sickening, cold clarity. We started putting the pieces together. It wasn't just a drunken mistake at the wedding. That wasn't Owen. He was too controlled, too calculated for that. I remember my mother telling me, "He tried to tell me it was just a moment of weakness, Brielle, that Kendall threw herself at him." That's what he told everyone. Kendall seduced him. He was a victim. But here's the thing. The first real crack that split the foundation of my entire life. Owen had told me 2 months earlier that he was cutting up all his old credit cards because he wanted a fresh financial start. He made a show of it, tearing them up in front of me, saying he was all in on our future. It was a beautiful, convincing moment of shared financial planning. And yet, my father, who, bless his heart, is a corporate investigator and knew how to pull strings, had already gotten the initial bank statements from our joint account that showed large, inexplicable withdrawals over the last 3 months. My father had confronted Owen about the money, and Owen's excuse for the missing thousands was that he'd used an old, forgotten credit card to pay for a special secret trip he was planning for my upcoming birthday. He said he had to use a card I didn't know about to keep the surprise. It sounded plausible when he said it, because he was always big on surprises. But now, in the sterile quiet of that motel room, staring at the stain on the carpet, the lie felt huge and heavy. If he had torn up all his old cards 2 months ago, how did he use a forgotten one 3 months ago? It was a simple, stupid hole in his story. The details didn't line up. It meant the lie about the money was deeper than the lie about the sex. It meant this wasn't just a drunken mistake. It meant he'd been planning, hiding, and calculating his deception for longer than I knew. He wasn't just sleeping with her. He was stealing from me, carefully constructing a narrative to cover his tracks. The infidelity was the scream. The financial deception was the whisper of a long, cold scheme. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The man I married hadn't just made a mistake. He had been building a separate life with my money, and he'd lied to my father to cover it. Connor and I rented an Airbnb in Sacramento, miles away from the Tahoe disaster, which was still dominating every news cycle and social media feed. The world saw the spectacle. We had to deal with the wreckage. We were sleeping on twin beds, 2 adults who had just had their lives scorched, and we realized we were the only ones who truly understood the depth of the other's pain. My parents were furious, Jasmine's parents were humiliated, but Connor and I were the ones who actually saw it. We were the victims who also became witnesses. Owen was still trying to reach me, texting my mom and my friends, saying he wanted to explain, saying I needed to hear his side. But I had already heard enough. The story about the forgotten credit card for the surprise trip kept looping in my head. He had made such a big deal about shredding all the old plastic. It was a performance, a guarantee of transparency. And now that detail was screaming lie at me. That's when I stopped being the grieving wife and became the investigator. I had a huge advantage. I had lived with him for 4 years. I knew his little hiding spots, the places he thought were clever, the places he knew I'd never look because I trusted him. I went back to our apartment in Sacramento while he was staying with his equally furious but slightly more protective cousin. I told him I was just packing clothes. He probably thought I was grabbing my most expensive designer things. But I went straight for his home office. I didn't bother with the locked safe. He'd expect that. I went for the ridiculous antique wooden file cabinet he never used, the one he always joked was just for show. I pulled out the bottom drawer, which was full of old manuals and takeout menus, and ran my hand along the very back of the drawer lining. My fingers brushed against something taped to the wood, something flat and thick. My heart was pounding like a drum against my ribs, and I could barely breathe from the dust and the sheer, horrible anticipation. I peeled it off. It was a small, accordion-fold envelope. Inside, I found 3 things that confirmed everything and sent a new, colder kind of dread coursing through me. First, a pristine, unopened credit card statement. Not an old, forgotten one, but a brand new, very expensive platinum card. The paper felt cold and heavy in my hand. Second, a copy of the monthly lease agreement for a small luxury apartment in downtown San Francisco. He had put a deposit down. Not for us. The lease started 2 months from the wedding date. But it was the third item that stopped the blood in my veins. It was a single laminated boarding pass stub for a flight to Cabo San Lucas. His name and Kendall's name. A flight departing the day after their planned surprise trip to see my mother in Phoenix. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It wasn't just a physical fling. This was an exit strategy. A whole second life, financed by my money, meticulously planned and timed to happen right after my brother's wedding. I remember standing there, the dusty filing cabinet drawer open, staring at that boarding pass stub, realizing I hadn't just married a cheat. I had married a sophisticated thief who had been building his escape route, piece by piece, right under my nose. The physical evidence of their betrayal, the sex in that storage room, was nothing compared to the paper trail of his emotional and financial abandonment. He didn't want a new start with me. He wanted an entirely new life with her, paid for with funds he stole from our joint accounts. He wasn't planning a surprise birthday trip for me. He was planning a life-changing, permanent disappearing act with her, and the wedding was merely their cover story. That's the moment the fear finally left me, replaced by an absolute icy fury. That apartment, that laminated ticket stub, it wasn't just proof, it was the entire ugly blueprint of their future. Owen wasn't some guy who messed up. He was an architect of cruelty. He and Kendall were planning their happily ever after, complete with a luxury San Francisco address and a flight to Cabo, and all of it was built on my trust and my half of our savings. I took the envelope and locked myself back in the Sacramento Airbnb with Connor. He was quiet, just staring out the window, brooding over his own shattered wedding day. I spread the evidence out on the kitchen counter. The lease, the card statement, the boarding pass. The way the light hit Kendall's name next to his on that flimsy paper made me feel physically ill. I called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Diana who specializes in these kinds of high-asset, high-drama dissolutions. She was furious, but professional. She told me to prepare myself, because people who plan this meticulously are usually hiding much more than they reveal. She said, "Brielle, a man who plans an exit for 8 months isn't just cheating, he's extracting." That's when Diana pulled the full records. It turned out Owen hadn't just opened one platinum card, he'd opened 3, all linked to a P.O. box in a different state that I didn't know about. And the money missing from our joint savings, that wasn't just for the rent deposit. It was gone, transferred out in a series of calculated withdrawals over the last 8 months, timed to coincide with his supposed business trips to Los Angeles. I realized the true scale of their scheme wasn't financial. It was personal. Remember when Kendall moved to Sacramento? She claimed it was to be closer to Jasmine before the wedding, to help with the planning. I had even helped her find her first apartment, thinking I was doing a nice sisterly thing. I had taken her out for dinner to welcome her to town. Now, Diana showed me a line item, a $5,000 payment to a consulting firm made by Owen. Diana traced the company name. It was a fake shell corporation. The money was a down payment on a sleek, expensive 2-seater sports car. The registration? It wasn't in Owen's name, it was in Kendall's name. She wasn't moving to Sacramento to be close to Jasmine. She was moving to Sacramento to be close to Owen. She was establishing residency, getting ready for their new life, while maintaining this whole innocent act around me. Every coffee we shared, every piece of advice I gave her about the city, every time she whispered to me about how excited she was for her sister's wedding, it was all a performance, a calculated setup. I was not just betrayed by my husband, I was infiltrated by a con artist who used her own sister's wedding as the grand distraction for her grand larceny. They weren't just taking my money, they were taking my time, my trust, and the genuine, good-hearted effort I made to welcome a lonely girl into my world. The deep, gut-wrenching realization was this. The scheme was far bigger than I could have imagined, involving a secret apartment, multiple credit cards, a shell company, and a brand new car, all secured while they played the perfect loyal family members. My own sister-in-law-to-be was not just cheating with my husband, she was helping him empty our accounts so they could buy a future with the life he was supposed to share with me. I looked at the counter, at the papers representing the theft of years of my hard work, and the bottom finally dropped out of my sorrow. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just felt this enormous heavy weight lift. The grief was replaced by a cold, steady purpose. I wasn't going to accept an apology, I wasn't going to settle for half of what was left. I was going to expose every single layer of this scam, because my family, my real family, Connor, deserved justice, and I deserved back every single dime they stole from my future. The game was over for them, and my fight was about to begin. Diana, my lawyer, told me not to talk to Owen, but I had to. Not to plead, not to argue, but to watch him perform one last time. I needed to see how convincing he was now that I knew the script. I agreed to meet him at a public spot, a cafe nowhere near our apartment. I arrived first, wearing the most neutral expression I could manage, my heart doing that awful, heavy throb against my ribs. I had the complete blueprint of his betrayal memorized. The San Francisco apartment, the shell company, the new car for Kendall. My only mission was to stay quiet, let him talk, and see if he'd slip up and give me an advantage. He walked in, looking like a wreck, but a calculated wreck. He had the puffy eyes, the 3-day stubble, the look of a man who's been through hell, the hell he created. He immediately launched into the familiar script. It was a mistake. He was weak, Kendall was manipulative, and he was completely and utterly remorseful. He kept repeating, "It was just sex, Brielle. The money, I was just trying to create a safety net for us because I was scared of telling you about the affair." The sheer audacity of that lie almost made me laugh out loud. A safety net? For us. He was funding his escape to Cabo with her. I kept my voice low, just focusing on details. I asked him, "So all the missing money was for that one surprise trip you mentioned to Dad?" I was fishing, seeing if he'd stick to the old shredded credit card lie. He nodded quickly, too quickly. "Every dime, honey. I'll make it up. I'll give you the accounts. I just need you to trust that I'm being completely transparent now." Transparent. He used that word while he was hiding a platinum card and a luxury lease. But then he made his mistake. His face softened, just for a second, in a way that made my skin crawl. He took my hand and said, "You know, I would never do anything to jeopardize our assets, Brielle. The only thing I care about is making sure my credit stays solid. We have to keep my name clean, right?" He emphasized the "my name" part, clearly worried about the financial consequences to himself. I just squeezed his hand back, feigning reassurance. "Of course, Owen, your name is important." It was a small moment, a flicker of vulnerability, but it was everything. He was so preoccupied with maintaining his credit score and his public image that he'd betrayed the only truly important detail of their future. I knew he was terrified of a messy public divorce that would ruin his professional standing and his spotless credit history. If he was worried about his name, it meant he had leveraged himself financially somehow in their scheme. It suddenly clicked. The new platinum cards he'd secretly opened, if I could prove he was moving the money to those accounts and then tie the spending on those cards directly to Kendall, the resulting debt would fall squarely on him. But how did they plan to deal with the inevitable property division? They were so set on their new life. They must have a plan to screw me out of the apartment I inherited from my grandmother, the apartment he always insisted was our safe haven. I asked him one final, quiet question before walking out. "What about the apartment, Owen? My grandmother's apartment. Do we sell it to pay off the debt?" He swallowed hard, looking relieved that I was talking about selling something. "Yes, we'll sell it. It's the easiest way to start fresh." He had the audacity to suggest selling my last piece of secure inheritance. As I walked away, I realized his mistake wasn't what he said, but what he was so desperately trying to protect. His biggest fear wasn't losing me, it was losing his financial reputation. And in his desperation to appear transparent and protect his name, he gave me the perfect weapon, a focus on his debt and his assets. The very thing I needed to seize was the one thing he thought I was too stupid to go after. He told me he only cared about keeping his credit solid, and in that moment, I knew exactly where I had to hit him to make him finally break. The meeting with Owen didn't give me closure. It gave me direction. His desperation to protect his credit rating told me everything I needed to know about his true motivation. It wasn't love for Kendall, not really. It was love for the comfortable, unblemished life he felt entitled to. He needed to keep his reputation clean so he could keep climbing the corporate ladder and pay for that new San Francisco apartment. My central wound wasn't just the betrayal, but the realization that my trust, my inherent belief in his honesty, was what he had used to steal my financial independence, the one thing my grandmother had fought so hard to secure for me. Diana and I shifted our focus from simply demanding a fair split to aggressively tracing the stolen money and connecting it irrevocably to Kendall. We needed to prove that Owen's debt was marital theft for an affair, not just standard reckless spending. The secret ally I needed was already by my side, Connor. He had his own fury, a cold, protective instinct that was terrifyingly effective. I needed to know how Owen and Kendall were coordinating their entire disappearing act without any digital trail, since he was so careful about his phone. I remembered that about a month before the wedding, Owen had installed a smart home hub in our living room. It was one of those things that controls the lights and the music, and I never used it. He had insisted it was for convenience. Connor, who is a genius with technology, looked at me and said, "Brielle, a smart hub is just a glorified recording device with a microphone." That was our ally. Connor found the account logs. Owen, the idiot, had set the hub to automatically record and save voice commands and communications between devices within the house, thinking only he could access them. He probably used it as a private messaging system with Kendall when he thought I was asleep or out. Connor downloaded everything. And that's when we discovered the true, chilling motivation behind the betrayal. It wasn't just money, it was contempt. I heard Owen's voice muffled, but undeniably him talking about me. He wasn't talking about love or passion for Kendall. He was complaining about me being too financially cautious, too focused on saving for a future he clearly didn't want. He said I was holding him back from a real luxury life because I wouldn't invest the inheritance money in one of his risky schemes. Then Kendall's voice, light and cold as glass. She said they had to lock it down quickly before my divorce from Owen could finalize and mess up his corporate accounts. She didn't want the money to be tied up in litigation. Their plan was to empty the account, leave, let me deal with the debt, and then start their new life clean. That recording solidified everything. It wasn't about love. It was about greed, opportunity, and his colossal ego. They weren't just running away. They were trying to financially destroy me before they vanished. But in that same file dump, we found the key to my counterattack. A voicemail left by Owen to the lawyer who set up his shell company, the one he paid $50 to for the car. In the voicemail, he explicitly stated that the purpose of the shell company, Vance Consulting, was to receive payments for services he performed outside of his main job, and that these funds were intended to be separate from any marital assets. That recording was the decisive resource I needed. It proved premeditation and a clear intent to defraud the marital estate. Diana said that evidence meant we could immediately file an injunction to freeze all assets related to Vance Consulting, including Kendall's new sports car, claiming them as marital property unjustly converted. The fight was no longer about recovering money. It was about proving that Owen, desperate to protect his reputation, was guilty of calculated fraud. That recording, the sound of his casual contempt, was the foundation of my case. I had his voice, and that voice was going to be the sound of his downfall. The sound of Owen's contemptuous voice, saved by a cheap smart hub, was my victory anthem, holding him back. That phrase was the final nail in the coffin of my sorrow. This was never about love. It was about his conviction that he deserved more than me, more than my stability, and more than the honest life we'd built. He saw my savings, my inheritance, as his final resource to fund his upgraded life with Kendall. Diana, my lawyer, was ecstatic about the recording. She said it was the equivalent of a smoking gun in financial fraud. It allowed us to bypass the usual months of back-and-forth discovery. We had premeditation. We had financial motive. We had the evidence of unjust conversion of marital property. We moved fast. The goal now was total strategic exposure, not just legal success. Owen cared about his name. We had to ensure his name was synonymous with fraud. I knew Owen had a major meeting scheduled. He worked in financial consulting, and his entire professional image relied on being perceived as a stable, trustworthy family man. He had a huge pitch presentation scheduled for the following week with a high-profile, ultra-conservative client in San Francisco, the kind of client who runs background checks on everyone involved. The kind of client who would drop him instantly if they smelled scandal. This pitch was the key to his next promotion. My plan wasn't to crash the wedding, it was to crash his career. Diana drew up the documents. An emergency motion for a temporary restraining order on the assets of his shell company, the $5,000 for Kendall's car, and a formal request to freeze the entirety of our joint investment account. The paperwork included transcripts of the Smart Hub recordings and photocopies of the lease and the Cabo ticket. The total picture painted a clear portrait of calculated marital fraud. The strategic move was in the timing. Diana would file the documents on the morning of his big presentation. But that wasn't enough. Owen was slippery. He needed to be physically stopped from walking into that meeting where he intended to charm his way into more wealth. My most crucial piece of preparation involved the apartment. The apartment I inherited from my grandmother, the one he wanted me to sell to pay off his affair debt. I had secretly met with the building manager, a kindly older man who had known my grandmother for years. I had him confirm that legally, Owen's name was not on the deed, only on the lease as a resident. The day before his big presentation, Connor and I went to the apartment. Owen was out, probably meeting Kendall or rehearsing his pitch. We changed the locks, electronically deactivated his smart hub access, and packed all of his clothes into black garbage bags, stacking them neatly by the curb. I left one single item on the kitchen counter: the laminated Cabo boarding pass, nestled on top of his copy of the divorce petition. I stood in that empty kitchen, looking at the stillness, the quiet that had replaced the deception. I felt the powerful hum of resolve. I had taken back my space, my home, my security. The confrontation wouldn't be a scream fest. It would be a cold, calculated delivery of consequences. And it would happen not in a courtroom, but in the heart of his professional ego. I took a deep breath, the air clean and cold now. Tomorrow, he was going to realize that the only thing I was holding back was my silence, and that silence was now armed and ready to fire. That last night in the apartment felt like the quiet before a storm. The apartment was stripped of anything that felt like Owen, and the silence was heavy but clean. I wasn't scared anymore. The fear had calcified into a hard, cold resolve. Owen, meanwhile, was unraveling. He kept calling, leaving increasingly desperate, unstable messages on my burner phone, the one I used just for him. He wasn't even attempting the remorseful husband act anymore. It was pure rage and anxiety. He was furious that Diana was demanding full financial disclosure, accusing me of trying to ruin his life. He said, "You are making this divorce messy. I told you I'd take care of you, but if you push this, you'll get nothing." His threats were empty. He didn't know I had his voice on tape admitting to the fraud. He didn't know I had the address of Kendall's new car. He was operating on the belief that I was still the naive, trusting wife who would fold under pressure to avoid a scene. That was his greatest weakness, his utter contempt for my intelligence. But I started noticing something else in his frantic messages, an edge of genuine panic about Kendall. He kept mentioning how she was overreacting to the divorce filing and how he needed to calm her down before his big presentation. He said something crucial on one of the messages. His voice strained. "Kendall thinks you know about the San Francisco lease. I told her you just saw the sex. Why is she freaking out about the lease?" That was the key. Kendall didn't trust Owen to handle the fallout. She was the junior conspirator, and she was clearly getting cold feet. Owen was having to manage his cheating mistress's emotional collapse while preparing for the biggest pitch of his career. Their alliance wasn't the strong, united front of master criminals. It was a fragile partnership built on shared greed, and it was cracking under the slightest pressure. Owen's biggest fear was exposure, but Kendall's fear was abandonment. If she thought I knew the full extent of the financial plan, she would panic and start making demands, risking the whole scheme. This instability between them was my final leverage. I didn't need to confront Kendall. I just needed Owen to think she was about to betray him before I did. I spent that night rehearsing the next morning in my head. Connor was leaving early to get eyes on Owen's corporate building, a cold glass tower in downtown San Francisco. Diana was already at the courthouse. The pieces were all in place for the final execution. I looked at the empty spot on the shelf where our wedding photo used to be. It wasn't sadness I felt, but a profound sense of justice earned. I had spent 8 months unknowingly playing a role in their destructive script. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be playing a role anymore. I was taking control of the narrative, and the ending was going to be mine. I just had to wait for the sun to rise, and then I would deliver the final, devastating truth. I drove to San Francisco that morning, not in the car Owen had me use, but in Connor's old truck. The fog was rolling off the bay, making the city feel cold and anonymous. I was dressed professionally, the complete opposite of the weeping woman Owen expected. I had my documents in a pristine briefcase, the full confession tucked away. Connor was already positioned a block away from the corporate tower, giving me the play-by-play. Owen was on time, looking impeccable in his suit, his mask of confidence firmly in place. He was carrying his presentation materials, completely unaware that his life was about to become the exhibit. My lawyer, Diana, had timed the filing perfectly. At 9:00 a.m. exactly, while Owen was on the elevator heading up to the executive floor, the emergency injunction was officially filed and served to his corporate office. It was a digital delivery, designed to cause maximum, immediate internal panic. I didn't try to go into the tower. I waited for him at the curb, exactly where his luxury Uber was dropping him off. He saw me standing there, calm and completely composed, and his face went white. Not just surprised, but a deep, bone-chilling white. He stammered something about a client meeting, asking what I was doing there. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him with the chilling neutrality of a judge. I told him he didn't have a client meeting. He had a fraud investigation. He started to sweat, even in the morning cold, and tried to walk past me, saying he couldn't talk right now. But I gently reached out, not to touch him, but to tap the briefcase in my hand. I told him Diana had just filed the motion. I leaned in just close enough so only he could hear the words that were about to obliterate his perfect reputation. I explained that the transcripts from the Smart Hub were included. I repeated the exact words I had heard him use about me holding him back, and about his plan to use the shell company, Vance Consulting, to hide assets. I let him know I had heard the whole ugly script. He froze. The knowledge that I had the audio of his private confessions was the trump card he never saw coming. It was worse than the Cabo ticket. It proved that his remorse was a lie and his financial deception was deliberate. Then I delivered the final calculated blow. I pulled out a single sheet of paper from the briefcase and handed it to him. It wasn't the divorce petition, it was the injunction order. I informed him that Diana was freezing the assets of Vance Consulting, and more importantly, the funds set aside for Kendall's new car. I explained that car was being seized as marital property. Then, I let him know I had changed the locks on the apartment and that his things were on the curb. He looked from the order to my face, his expression contorting into a perfect mix of rage, terror, and total defeat. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had lost his freedom, his money, and his reputation in one swift, devastating move. I watched him drop his presentation notes. The paper scattered on the sidewalk near the entrance of the tower, a beautiful metaphor for his shattered career. I knew he realized in that moment that all his careful planning to protect his name had been utterly useless. I watched him try to blame me, saying that I had ruined him. No, I replied, the word clean and sharp. I told him he had ruined himself the moment he thought my honesty was a weakness he could steal from. I made sure he understood he was finding out what happens when the naive wife decides to play for keeps. The silence after the confrontation in front of that glass tower was absolute. I left Owen there, standing amidst his scattered papers, the man who cared more about his credit score than his marriage, facing the ultimate corporate humiliation. That day was the official end of his respectable life. The legal fallout was swift and devastating, exactly as Diana had promised. The evidence of financial fraud, the shell company, the new platinum cards, the audio recording, was irrefutable. Owen's attempts to protect his name backfired completely. He lost his job within a month when the information inevitably leaked through the office grapevine, and the court ruled against him on every major point. I recovered nearly all the funds he had stolen, and the judge ruled that he had to sell his own separate assets to cover my legal fees. He didn't get a dime from the apartment my grandmother left me. That home, my inheritance, was protected, just like my brother protected me. And Kendall? She got her share of the consequences too. Owen cut her off immediately after the injunction, blaming her for making him sloppy. She lost the car, the San Francisco apartment lease was canceled, and she had to move back to her parents' house, who, let's just say, were not throwing any celebratory parties. Her betrayal of her own sister and my marriage was too public and too ugly to ignore. She lost her social standing, her fancy new life, and the man she tried to steal. But the real ending to this story isn't about their downfall. It's about my new beginning. A year later, Connor and I are roommates in a huge, sunny loft in Portland. We are the ultimate power twin duo. He found a new, truly amazing woman named Simone, who actually laughs with him, not at me. He's happy again, and watching him heal has been my greatest comfort. As for me, I took the settlement money, combined it with my grandmother's legacy, and did what I always dreamed of. I started my own graphic design firm. It was terrifying at first, but I realized that if I could orchestrate the downfall of a calculated financial manipulator, I could certainly run a business. My hands, the ones that once shook with fear in that dark corridor, are now steady and strong, building a future that is entirely my own creation. The final plot twist wasn't a document or a confession. It was a deep, quiet realization within myself. The pain of the betrayal was colossal, but it was also a cleansing fire. I used to define my security by the man beside me. Now, I define it by the business I built, the roof over my head that belongs only to me, and the unshakable trust I have in myself and my real family. Owen wanted me to be small, to be the cautious wife he could manipulate. He never understood that the honest, cautious woman he married was also incredibly resilient, and that she had a brother who taught her how to fight. I look at the world differently now. I trust, yes, but I verify. And I cherish the few people who showed up for me when my world was in flames. This is a story about how losing everything can be the best way to find out what you're really made of. It's about how the money I recovered was nothing compared to the self I got back. If you've listened to this whole raw confession, from the shock of the wedding to the clean light of this new life, I want to hear from you. Let me know what city you're listening from in the comments below. And if you want to keep hearing stories of how women turn the tables on those who try to break them, stick around. You won't want to miss what I share next.